Section 6D, this is the fourth part for Unit 6. This will be focusing on immigration, although a lot of this is focusing on the late 1800s, early 1900s. Many of these ideas spread out over any time period. Political machines, we used to have a lot more in depth, but we're just going to touch upon it. You'll have more in U.S. government on there, but they are related with the immigrants side of this. For standards, a lot of standards that are touched in parts on, some that you directly, like you are almost for sure going to have an EOC question on 3.7 about it, comparing the experience of different European and Asian immigrants there. For our bracketing dates, we're focusing probably mainly on like 1890s to about 1924 for the immigration side of this. The political machines actually started, some of that is actually even before the Civil War there for political machines, and then going through the Progressive era. All right, for the immigration push-pull factors that we have in here, think about when people move. I know the chart says number 1, freedom. That would actually be number 2. The reason most people move comes down to economics. They have jobs. Whether you're moving from country to country or within a country, normally the number 1 factor is something with economics there. Freedom is important for a lot of migrants. We did have people for both religious and economic political freedoms that will move here there, but again, that's usually secondary to jobs. For abundant land, this is where the railroads, when they were trying to give a chance, and the Homestead Act that we had that they didn't have in Europe. Now, what's pushing them out of Europe is some of the same things that were happening in the United States were occurring in Europe. The Industrial Revolution was making so many changes. The agricultural changes, they did not need as many farmers. So if you were an Italian farmer living in a valley in North Italy, you had 3 sons, your 50-acre farm, you could not split that farm up for all 3 sons to farm. So this is where some of them would be moving, and that we had more room in the United States. Population growth in Europe. Crop failures, when you think of like the Irish potato famine that you have, and again, religious and political turmoil that some people will be coming then for the freedom side that we have. What are the problems? Now, this is any time period. We could be talking about 1820, 1920, 2020 there. But immigrants will be discriminated against, but some will be more than others. There isn't a true list with this, but there are certain things. One thing I don't have on here is sometimes looks. Like a person that is from Asia would probably be distinguished more than a person that was from Germany. They're simply because of looks. But usually one of the biggest barriers you have is language. It's easier for a person from Australia to migrate here than a person from Germany there if they don't know English. Second is poverty. If you're rich, you can overcome a lot of things, but most of our immigrants are not rich there. Religion. The United States, even though we have freedom of religion, we still have the basis that was more Protestant Christian. So we'll find that even immigrants that are Catholic will be discriminated against that you have. Cultural differences. A lot of times you kind of have to explain to your parents that it's not 1990 anymore. Well, can you imagine if you also had to say this is not North Africa, all right, or this is not North Mexico that you have. So cultural differences that you have from places there. And again, what we have for looks that you have, and all the things that you have, the more of those in there, the more likely that you're going to be discriminated against. Now, a word, and we'll see the definition later on, their nativism is the favoring of native-born people over immigrants, not Native Americans. There's been plenty of discrimination there, but native-born people that we have had come. All right, we have a lot of times where we use the phrase America's like a melting pot. And so you see the picture on the left there where everything gets kind of mixed in together, and that's what makes American. But we aren't all in one way. And this is where I had a professor one time that had said, we're more like a salad. And what his analogies that he gave is that us all the things mixed together that makes us a salad there. And the salad is the thing that makes it good is all the mixture of it. Had a student of mine that said to the professor, no, we're a stew there. And what she was saying was, yes, there are the mixtures of this. So the salad, maybe I'm in here, maybe the Germans are the carrots that are here. But what she was saying is, you could, if you take this carrot out of the salad, wash it off, it hasn't changed chemically. But in the stew, you have the carrot, you take it out, you still know it's a carrot, but it's changed. And she was saying you can't take someone, put them in America for 3 years, take them out, and not have them change. Plus, she said a whole lot of us are kind of like that goo. We're a little bit of everything in there. The juices of the things that are mixing together. All right, take a look at this picture. It was from Puck Magazine. And take a second to look at it. Pause your screen if you can there. But you'll notice in here that we have, and I guess this example of nativism here. You have a poor person coming on. You can see we're carrying everything home, even down the coffee pot. Meanwhile, the 5 men, they're quite rich. You can see by the way they're dressed. I mean, most of them have been well fed. They got a bigger gut than I have even. But this is where you see they look like richer men. But look at the shadows. And this is where the idea that their ancestors were different stereotypes that you have. And you can see that they were poor. And this is one thing that we have like a cycle in America where we seem to have one group in there that when they come, they get discrimination. That maybe a generation 2, 3 later, they're discriminating against others. The Irish were discriminated against heavily in the mid-1800s, and then they're going to be discriminating against people that are coming from Russia and Italy at the turn of the century. And some of those same people that their ancestors came to Italy then are some of the same people that are protesting immigration today. That we have are against it. So again, that's where nativism comes in. The vocabulary you definitely need to know is old immigrants versus new immigrants. The old immigrants from the early 1800s, Irish, Germans, English, Scandinavians, so from Western, Northern Europe. The new immigrants are the ones that came from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean area there. Italians, Greeks, Polish, Russians, the Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. So those areas in there, that's where they were coming from. So many of you, if you trace back for Italian or something, that's where they came in large numbers during that time period at the turn of the century. Many of them, especially from Italy, were birds of passages. Their plan was they were going to come to America, work, make some money, send some money back home, and then they were planning to go back home. But most of them didn't. The birds of passages ended up usually staying that they had. The two graphs, you can't see them very well in here, and we're going to come back to this when we get to the 1920s unit. But you will see with the years that in about 1890s, we have this huge spike in the number of immigrants that were coming over, and that will last until the big drop is basically the start of World War I. There's going to be a backlash against these new immigrants, most of them from families that were the old immigrants. All right, 2 places you need to know: Ellis Island, Angel Island. The video we watched the other day about Ellis Island said that over 100 million Americans can trace back someone that came through Ellis Island. And in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, we'll have over 12 million immigrants that come through there. If you have some background that is Asian, it may be that Angel Island was a point. There are other places. New Orleans had a lot of people from Portugal and Italy that came over. I know my wife, when I was tracing her ancestors, they came through Baltimore. And what they would have is these processing stations that they would go, and people would come in, they would do inspections on them, checking, and they would do physicals. One thing they really looked for at the time was to make sure no one had tuberculosis. They would get either approved or deported. Some of them had their names misspelled, sometimes on purpose, sometimes because the person couldn't understand you there. I know in our show and tell that we'll have some people will give an example of where they had a letter that was changed in there, and that would be then your permanent name that you would have. Again, some people would do it on purpose to try to not sound like they were from another country. All right, you notice that one standard earlier, 3.7, where to distinguish the difference between what Asian Americans or Asian immigrants had and those that were from Europe. Both groups will have discrimination, but once over from Asia, it'll be even more direct. You see their anti-coolie clubs. Those were anti-Chinese clubs. So we'd actually have clubs going. We're later on going to have the immigration restriction leagues that are be against all immigrants, but they will purposely be really against Asians. We will actually have a law in 1882 that will outlaw any more immigration coming from China for the next 10 years. When that 10 years was up, we had it then in 1892. That 10 years was up, we will make another in 1902. We then make it permanent, although the permanent will end in the 1940s when China is battling with us on our side against Japan. For the Japanese, we will have segregated schools in California, not black and white. They were segregated with Asians and particularly Japanese there that were not allowed to be in the schools. Japan also had other problems, and we will end up with what's called the Gentleman's Agreement. It sounds really nice, but we pretty much will ban the immigration of Japanese to Americans. By the time we get to 1924, we will ban all Asians in there with the National Origins Act there and the immigration bill that was passed at that time. We don't have a Italian Exclusion Act or a German Exclusion Act or a Russian Exclusion Act. And that's why I say, why is there so much discrimination against Asian groups? Part of it goes back to that slide I was saying before, where you can kind of check off. First of all, for Asians, usually they were easier to distinguish by looks. And then you go through different language, different religion, different culture. Most of them were poor that came over on that. And another factor that you have is there was also a jealousy, because a lot of the Asian groups were very successful and were quickly out of poverty. And some of them, like some stereotypical businesses they had, were like laundries in California, things like that. So this is where the jealousy also goes with that side of it. Oh, look at the cartoon on the bottom right. And this is where your EOC, a lot of times they will use cartoons in this way. What is used as a stereotype for the Chinese is the ponytail. So you notice the ponytail coming from there. The cartoon says the Chinese must go in here, and so it's just chasing away. Notice with these different cartoons, the one on the far left, and again you notice the ponytail, and now Uncle Sam's kicking him out. For this one, you see the ponytail, the gates of liberty, as the Chinese man is not allowed into liberty and freedom. This one's a lot harder to see, as small as it is, but same idea, where they were banning the Chinese from there. Another one, the Chinese must go, working man party. Notice again the ponytail, as basically the working man's party of California is kicking them out. This one you're going to see in a bigger version and in our DBQ that we're going to be doing later on this week. You will notice in the background that the wall is actually being torn down. In the late 1800s, China was actually opening up to other areas. Meanwhile, in the United States, we're building a wall. And as it got bigger in there and you were to be able to zoom in the faces, you will notice that there's some people of different ethnic groups, like people that were Italian, Irish. You see a black man that were helping to build that wall, trying to keep the Chinese out. This is a good example of how an EOC question can take that same standard but make it into another question. This is one that I'm not saying they're trying to trick you, but this is where you have to read the question. It's actually a very simple question, but by them adding stonemasons, women, farmers, Jews, they make it seem more difficult. This is about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which in 1882 again banned the Chinese. So that's why it will be Chinese women. Doesn't matter if they're stone masters or farmers. And then Russian Jews, we're going to have a lot of discrimination against the people of Jewish faith. We're going to see that in the 1920s time period. All right, once the immigrants arrived, we're going to have these political machines that I'm going to have later on. Now, what political machines would do is help them to get a place to live, help them get a job there. But they wanted something in return. They wanted to make sure that they could vote here. Where we're going to show you a scene from Far and Away there, that you'll see that. Another good movie with a lot of violence that you watch, Gangs of New York, shows a lot of things with the political machines in here. Most of them would come when they moved to the cities. We're going to have different ethnic communities in different areas. You could walk down in different areas in like Milwaukee or Chicago and never hear English, where it may be German or Polish. Same thing's true today. If you go to Miami, there's areas that speak only Creole or Spanish there. So that hasn't changed. For tenements, in our next section of notes, we'll talk about with some of the urbanization, and these were some of the buildings like the dumbbell apartments that many of these immigrants were living in. A word that you should know from back with our Native American section is assimilation, and this is where we were trying to Americanize our immigrants when they come in. The unions, which in the disguise of trying to stop more child labor, will say that they needed more schooling. And so we will have more mandatory schooling from most places up to like 13 or 14 years old. We also start school earlier. That's why you didn't start in first grade, you started in kindergarten, because to start younger, to try to Americanize these immigrants. Much like we did with the Indians with the Dawes Acts in here. We're going to have settlement houses, which is another part in the next section, that we're going to have people that are going to try to help the immigrants, but at the same time, we're going to have these clubs called Immigration Restriction Leagues, which are going to start in the 1880s, and they're going to keep growing, and they're going to call for quotas. What a quota is when they were trying to eliminate or lessen the numbers, and you only allow a certain number of people from each country. Immigration with unions is kind of ironic because when the immigrants did come and work, the unions would then go and recruit them to be in the unions, but they would oppose any future immigration. And it comes down again where I have the question, why would union leaders oppose more immigrants? Is the more immigrants you have, the more competition for the jobs. So the union leaders are trying to protect the jobs they already had there. All right, this backlash against the immigrants is kind of a segue to something we'll have later on in the 1920s, but where we had those anti-immigration leagues that were started and restriction leagues in there, that's going to keep growing during the early 1900s. We're going to have groups, some of them that are seen in a positive stance, some of them that are negative, that are going to keep growing, like the American Legion, which was one that, the American Legion does a lot of great things for patriotism, but as we look at in World War II, we're going to see what's the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Again, where is the line? There is no set line, but where can you go too far? And then when we said the 1920s, we're going to see that is going to be the rebirth of the KKK. It's going to, in the early teens, start up again in the South, but it's going to spread. It is actually going to be very strong in the North. We're going to find that the KKK stayed in the 1920s with the state of Indiana. There, and this is where the KKK will be against anything American or un-American. This is where they're going to have a slogan of 100% American, and they are 100% Americanism. They are going to be against anything that is not what they think of as American. So they're going to be against now Catholics, immigrants, Jewish people, and that's where it's going to be so strong in certain northern states. Again, Indiana being the biggest. Now, this is one section in the notes, but this is actually one that's important for some things that happen later on. The Senate will investigate all the problems in the United States, and this Dillingham report in 1911 will pretty much blame everything on immigrants. Why do we have more crime? Oh, this is because of immigrants. Why are there too many poor people? It's immigrants. Why do we have too much alcoholism? It's immigrants. So it was blaming all of our problems on the immigrants. Some of the things that were done, like the 18th Amendment, were done in part because of this there. As the Dillingham report said that we had alcoholism at high rates because of groups like the Italians and the Russians that drank at large amounts. That will actually be part of the push for the 18th Amendment to ban alcohol. After World War I, we are going to have the Red Scare. We're going to have a major push for quotas, and in 21 and 1924, we're going to have different quota acts. The cartoon on the bottom left, we're going to see this a bit in bigger version when we get to the 20s and go deeper into it. But you see it's a funnel, and Uncle Sam's on the other end of the funnel. It says 3% there because what they're trying to do is limit the population, the number of people coming from Europe. So that's where the quotas come from. For Florida, we did not have a huge number of immigrants, but we did have more than what you would have in other places of the South. Some that you may be more familiar with here, not too far from this area. Ybor City in Tampa, the cigar industry and thousands of People working in buildings like this that were rolling cigars that came from Cuba. It was originally in Key West, but it will move to Ybor City. I know most of you, if you go to Tampa, you think of Ybor City now more for the restaurants and the bars and that entertainment area, but that's where it started out. Tarpon Springs started where there was the sponge industry, and actually again moved from the Keys but moved to Tarpon Springs, and they will have over 1,000 Greeks that will come, and they will be in these sea suits, and they will be walking along the bottom of the shore and cutting out the sponges in the sponge bed. Today there's more of a tourist that you have in there, a lot of great Greek restaurants in that area. Zolfo Springs, most people don't know where it is. It's next to Watchula, and again, most people don't know that, but it's about 60 miles, 60 miles east of Bradenton. And that little town started from Italians that were working on the plant railroad system, and then they settled here longer term. This map's a little bit confusing in some ways, but it's kind of showing where different ethnic groups were. It's not the best for showing, but I do know right here, you'll notice that the dark green is where Italians are in New York, New Jersey area. The Germans people of German ancestry seem to dominate a lot of it, but a lot of the Germans spread to rural areas. All right, the list section, I have an entire section for AP. We used to have for regular in there, but we spliced it down a lot less because where I used to have a section that on each and every president, what happened in their terms, don't now. Now, Mark Twain will coin the term Gilded Age for the late 1800s. It's usually associated with the politics and the business when we think of the robber barons of before. Now, I always look at them where I have that list or there's all those pictures on it. Think, what is the best president or a good president that is between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt? And we have pretty much 4 decades there. And most people can't name one, or they might name Grant. But kind of going left to right, Andrew Johnson, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated, is seen in history as one of our worst presidents. I mean, usually on the level of James Buchanan and Warren G. Harding there. Grant was a great general, but we're going to see in a little bit that he's mainly known for the scandals, and his time as presidency was not real successful. He did have some bright moments there, like with what he did of trying to go and take down the KKK, but he wasn't able to. Hayes is most known for the Compromise of 1877, and unfortunately one of the most honest men that we have, people thought it was a fraud, and so his 4 years, not much was accomplished there. 1880, we will have Garfield that is elected. After he becomes president, not too long later, he is shot, and he'll spend a couple of months before he dies. Takes over for him is Chester Arthur, who you can actually, if you go deep enough for Chester Arthur, you can see some of the things that he pushed, like updating the Navy. And some people give the argument that he was the best. But he was just kind of seen as a political man that was there to balance off with, we'll see, the Republicans fighting. Next one, 22nd President, Grover Cleveland. He is the only Democrat during this time period that is elected, and he's elected in part because of Republicans. There's a group called mugwumps. I'm not making that up, but mugwumps were Republicans that would vote for any Democrat that they felt was not too extreme and was not a crook. There have been so much corruption and problems with the Republican Party. So Cleveland is our only Democrat elected, but he's elected by the help of a group of Republicans. Some things right now that kind of be similar. This is where we have what's called the Lincoln Project, where there's this group of Republicans that are against Trump there, that they said they'd vote for a Democrat just because they are against Trumpism. And maybe 4 to 8% of Republicans that are like they're hoping to get with this. Next guy, after Cleveland serves 1 term, he's defeated by Benjamin Harrison, and then we come back 4 years later. Cleveland comes back again. Cleveland is our 22nd and our 24th president there. And then we get to William McKinley, but probably not names that you think of in here. So the biggest theme during this time period is not going to be our presidents, it's going to be the political machines. And when you look at it there, where most of them are Republicans there, it seems like the Republicans dominated, but the average difference in the popular vote was left for all those presidential elections was less than 1.5%. So they were very close elections that you have. And periodically we would be switching on who was controlling the legislative branch in there. And where Republicans controlled some areas, the Democrats had strongholds in the southern states and in most cities. Now, the political machines are the things that you need to focus on here. They started out as social clubs, as we see, we'll show you the scene from Far and Away. But you would have these ward bosses that would help out these immigrants. They would get them jobs. They would give them places to live there. But what they were wanting in return is to make sure that they're able to vote there. Now, they did good things with helping them here, and it got them involved in the political process. But the major negative was going to be the corruption, corruption that you have. And so this is where we're going to have, and both Republicans and Democrats had it. We're going to focus, though, and the one that you do need to know off the top of your head will be Tammany Hall. It is a Democratic political machine. This guy, Boss Tweed, was not ever elected to any position, but he controlled New York City politics for 3 decades there. And what he would do is he would have these different groups and make sure that they pledged votes. And when they went to vote, they would vote for the people that he told them to vote. And they didn't have secret ballots at that time. Sometimes if you were in New York City, all you got was a ballot that had nothing but Democrats on it. And that's who you voted for. And he and his cronies pretty much will go and take about half the money for New York City. Now, before we go thinking, okay, it's all Democrats, Republicans had their own machine. We're going to have the stalwarts that controlled many other areas in the state of New York. We have the half-breeds that controlled areas throughout the North also for Republicans. So the political machines were both. I like to point out, and this we're going to see some political cartoons that Thomas Nast made there, and that'll be what helps bring down Boss Tweed. People had been writing editorials and writing stories about how bad Boss Tweed was cheating and doing things, but people didn't read 3-page stories on this. But they looked at the cartoons. And like in this cartoon, you can't really make out the face, but people knew who it was with this big guy on there. Knew it was Boss Tweed, and this is the ballot box. And the idea like what today we would have for intimidation of the voters in here. On this one, this is called 'Twas Him. They're all pointing, saying it was someone else's fault in here, but you notice who's the biggest guy? It's Boss Tweed. What will end up happening for Tweed is he will eventually be arrested. Now, the New York City police and the justices were pretty much in his pocket. So he was given a sentence of house arrest and went to his giant mansion in Manhattan. And he will then sneak out, and the police look the other way, and he goes to Spain. Eventually, he will be caught and brought back for America. Now, for Thomas Nast, I wanted to kind of also have with him, he's seen as the father of the American political cartoon. Your image of Santa Claus is because of Thomas Nast. If you think of Santa Claus as a nice, fat, jolly, bearded man, Thomas Nast is the one that started drawing him that way, where before Santa was beardless and usually skinny there, so not so jolly looking there. Some other cartoons, this one here, even though there's no face on it, people knew that's Boss Tweed. There. Notice that he's in stripes there, when you think of gels in there, trying to stop democracy here. All right, some other things, the last bit for the political machines. And one of the problems that we have the political machine, and there's where some vocabulary what you have, is going to be the fact that we're going to have people that are getting jobs not by their ability, but like who they voted for. We didn't have secret ballots, so you could actually lose your job because of who you voted for and president for as low as a level as maybe even working in a post office there. And so this is where we would have mass changes. So we'd have patronage. So they're given the jobs because they are loyal party members or they're friends of the people. This did not just start with political machines. It started earlier, most famous for President Jackson with the spoils system in here. President Grant, one of the problems that he will have is that there was so much corruption, and a lot of it goes back to the political machines. Now, today, a lot of times we use the word gate at the end of some corruption that we have, going back to Watergate. In those days, a lot of times would use the word ring in here. So some of the scandals that we had at that time, the credit mobilier, where there was kickbacks from people to railroads, the Indian rings, where money that was supposed to go towards these reservations and help with the Indians was not getting there. The whiskey rings, where people were revenuers they would go and they would skim off of the amount that was given. Like the tax bill might actually be $5,000. They would write it up for $3,000, and then they would get $1,000 cash for it. The Navy ring scandals is where we will have things that were bought at a much higher price than they should have. A lot of this happened during Grant's presidency. This is where you see this cartoon that's supposed to be President Grant, all these other rings there for his scandals. Unfortunately for President Grant, he was a really nice guy. He was a very trusting guy, and he appointed way too many of his supposed friends to high-ranking offices. And so a lot of corruption came from that. And this is where, when you are president, if there is scandals that are below you, you're the one that's responsible for that. Another major thing in 1880, we were going or 1881, newly elected President Garfield is going to be assassinated. Now, I'm not making these names up, but Garfield was a half-breed, one of the political machines for the Republicans. The person that assassinated him when he shot him said, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is now president." There. Garfield will take him a while before he dies. A lot of that is because of the bad medical things they had at that time. This is where I tell more of a story about it in class, but for time I won't have with there. But he will end up dying, but it led to, and this is the important thing that you need to know, the Pendleton Act there. Arthur will actually push for having this. It reforms the civil service jobs. What it will do is try to take it away where it's not so much patronage who you vote for. And all except for our top jobs use the merit system on there. You're going to go more in depth in this in your government class, especially if you take AP in here. But this is where we will have the reform of the service jobs in there. This last bit, I kind of summarized, and this is where it's kind of our stepping stone, what will be our next unit. But the political machines, we start some reform, but most of that reform is going to be done, and guess what? The progressive era. We're going to have a lot of tax and tariff issues in the late 1800s. It's going to lead to the income tax and a lot of other reforms in the progressive era. For businesses in the late 1800s, we're going to have the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Interstate Commerce Act, other things that we're going to have more and more government regulation of business, and we'll have more of that in the progressive era. Going back to the farmers, we're going to have them that they're going to end up forcing Republicans and Democrats to change their policies, and that during the progressive era, both of those parties will change immensely on there. So this is kind of our segue to what will be in Unit 7 when we have the progressive era.